All right. If you have a Bible, turn with me to our passage. It's going to be in Genesis 11. So the first 11 chapters of Genesis, they lay the foundation for the whole Bible. And we heard this morning from Scott, when he's reading from Paul in his letter to the Philippians, about the basis for the proper Christian mindset. Well, in Genesis chapters 1 through 11, Moses is recording the origins of mankind in order to lay a foundation for the proper biblical worldview, a God-centered worldview for the people of Israel, and to expose the pattern of man's relentless pursuit of prideful rebellion. So think back to the early chapters of Genesis. You have the glory of God in creation. He created man in his image, assigns them the responsibility of ruling, of dominion over the earth, and he commands them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And then shortly after, we see sin enter the world. Then right after that, that first disobedience, starting with Adam and Eve, man's prideful rebellion, quickly becomes a major theme. So the wickedness of man becomes so rampant that God sends a worldwide flood and resets humanity, preserving only 8 people. Then about 100 years pass, and the story picks up in our passage in Genesis 11. So starting in verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth. And they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. So before we begin, I want to point out something about the structure of this passage. There's a literary form in Hebrew called a chiasm that you might remember from our series in the Gospel of Mark. It's when an idea or a sequence of events is presented, and then it's reversed and repeated. So it's not a popular form in English, but you can kind of see it in a quote like, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Or in the verse Scott mentioned this morning, that he who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. So you have that reverse and repetition. So in this passage here, there's a chiasm or a chiastic structure, and it's useful for memorizing if you live in an oral culture, but the primary purpose of it is to highlight a central theme in the passage that the author wants to emphasize. So we're going to see if there's something Moses particularly wants to emphasize in this passage. And first I'm going to show you how you see that chiastic structure. So if you're looking at the passage, I'm going to jump from the beginning to the end of it. Looking at it, we see in verse 1, there's a unity of language. And then in verse 9, the Lord confuses the language. In verse 2, they settle in one place. And in verse 8, people are scattered throughout the earth. Then in verse 3, a plan is forming, and in verses 6 and 7, you see the plan is disrupted. Finally, verse 4 and the second half of verse 5 reference the building project. So the first 4 verses focus on the actions and words of mankind, and then the final 4 verses focus on God's words and actions. So this definitely would fit the pattern of a Hebrew chiasm, which means that the central idea Moses intends to communicate would be found at the center of those parallel statements we found. So that would be at the beginning of verse 5. So keep that in mind as we work through the passage, that verse 5 is going to function as a sort of hinge for the passage. Okay, let's begin. And here's the outline. 2 main points we're going to see in verses 1 through 4, man's prideful pursuit of self-exaltation. And then in verses 5 through 9, we'll see God's gracious response of condescension. So first, man's prideful pursuit of self-exaltation. In verse 1, now the whole earth had one language and the same words. So what's the emphasis here? unity. There's only one language. The entire world population at this time speak it. And some scholars have attempted to argue that maybe this is saying there's just a common business language or a trade language, that it's just one of many languages, but this is one that they share. But the text just says one language, says literally one lip, and that they had the same vocabulary. So imagine how incredible that would be to be able to communicate perfectly with every single person on earth. If you were there at this time, you could overhear a conversation between middle schoolers and actually understand what they're saying. So everyone had the same language, and that's the main point that's being emphasized there. Now look at verse 2. It came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. So people are traveling. They're trying to find a place to live. And at first glance, it might seem like there's nothing very significant going on so far. Moses is just giving us some background information before he gets to the important parts of the story, right? That's what it seems like. Well, if you were an Israelite hearing this, or if you have familiarity with the book of Genesis, these are not trivial details. In fact, Moses is incorporating particular details that would be like red flags. They would indicate that something is not right here in this passage. So that first warning sign you see is people are journeying east. In the book of Genesis, east and moving east always carries a negative connotation. So starting with Adam and Eve, when they're expelled from the garden, where do they end up? East of Eden. Then, in Genesis 4, after Cain kills Abel, God curses him and he leaves and goes even further east. And then after that, in chapter 13, Abraham and Lot decide to part ways. Abraham offers Lot a choice to decide which direction he wants to go first, and Abraham will go the other. And what does Lot choose? He chooses to go east and ends up settling among the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then after Jacob deceives his brother and father, and he's sent away, he heads in the same direction. So in Genesis, going east is always associated with leaving God's presence, leaving his blessing. And another red flag for anyone who's familiar with these chapters that are leading up to this one in the beginning of Genesis is that they settled. But what's wrong with that? They settled. So if you think back to Genesis 1, what did God instruct Adam to do? In Genesis chapter 1, to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth. Adam's purpose as an image bearer of God was to put God's glory on display throughout the whole world, to fill the earth with image bearers that would point to God and exalt him. But not only was that command given to Adam, though, but it was reiterated right after the flood. Noah received the same command. At the beginning of Genesis 9, you can see that. But yet, mankind still chose to settle. So continuing to verse 3, and they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. So here there's one more warning sign that Moses is including here. They're making bricks. But that's to be expected, right? If you're building something, bricks is a pretty common material to use to build. Well, not in ancient Israel. It's not as common. It's actually, there are so many rocks over ancient Israel. There's a joke that people make there that God sneezed rocks all over the place. It's just covered in rocks. So that's what they would build with. It was easy to use. It was all there. There's plenty of it. And every once in a while, they'd carve or fashion them a little bit, but bricks were not a main tool that they used for building in Israel. In fact, it was more common in Babylon or Egypt to use bricks. And one other common practice of Babylon in their building projects, they'd carve the king's name or whoever was financing or responsible for the project into every single brick. So the point of that was to give the king glory, to give the king pride. There was an association with the king's reputation and the impressiveness and size of his building projects. And you can see an example of that with King Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4. So we got these three red flags already in the passage: moving east, settling, and making bricks. And Moses is dropping these hints to alert us to the fact that something is off here. It's like when you're in the theater watching a movie and the main character is doing some mundane everyday activity in the movie. Like let's say they're like in the car driving to work, or they're just sitting at home, just doing mundane activity. And you think, oh, this is a good time to go and refill my popcorn. There's nothing happening here. I won't miss anything. And then suddenly the music changes. It gets really ominous. You hear these minor chords start coming in, and you sit back down, right? You're like, something's about to happen. Something's off. It doesn't feel right. Something bad's going to happen. And that's what Moses is signaling with these details. So an Israelite reading this, or someone who's followed the path in Genesis, would notice there's something off about this. These seemingly innocuous details are actually foreshadowing sin and serious consequences. So now in verse 4, then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." So often in Old Testament narratives, it's a little bit trickier to figure out what's the main purpose and what's the main emphasis in the passage. But here you just have the people say, this is what we're doing. This is our purpose. Here's our plan. So here's the intention of their hearts right here. It's clearly articulated. For this building project, the statement reveals that it's pointing to characteristics of pride. It reveals that pride is the root motivation. But there's actually, I think there's 4 characteristics that you can see about the pride, even just in this verse. So I want to look over those 4 characteristics of pride. So first, human pride metastasizes in community. So in other words, there's an amplifying effect when there's evil being done in sinners when they're in unity. They say, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make a name for ourselves." So this is a unified pursuit of wickedness. And this has been true of humanity from the moment sin entered the world. You see that about the human heart. It's dominated by that delusion of autonomy, the desire to live independently from God, independently from their creator. But it does not seek solitude. We don't seek to be alone for the most part. Rather, just as Eve passed the fruit to Adam, sinners love company. Sure, there are some sins that people may try to keep private, but that's more of an observation of cultural norms than of moral norms. How many times have you heard or thought to yourself, well, everyone else is doing it. Everyone at my job uses profanity. Everyone else my age is involved in sexual immorality. And they say they're still Christians, so why do we do that? Why do we use that rationalization, that justification based off of our environment and the people around us? We tell ourselves that everyone's doing it, so it can't be that bad, right? Well, the company of sinners just gives us an easy excuse to ignore the conscience, to soothe the guilt that we feel when we recognize sin. It turns off those alarms of the conscience because we just look at them and say, it can't be that bad. They're doing it too, right? And that's the trajectory of the world from this time period, from the beginning, still today. Rebellion against God is celebrated as following your heart, or living your truth, or being your authentic self. And since this is increasingly the direction of society, we have to be cautious about the company we keep. Are there friendships or any social settings that we may be better off giving up to preserve the tenderness of our conscience? If so, then what are you waiting for? What hope are you holding on to? Remember what Paul says after describing man's corruption and descent into sexual immorality at the end of Romans 1. So starting verse 28. "And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but, listen to this, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them." So there are no parades of pride or lust or deceit or any other sins on the narrow road. And if you just want to watch and give your implicit approval, the passage that I just read from Paul would make you think, oh, I should probably look and see, like, which path am I standing on? Where am I walking? So secondly, another characteristic of pride that you see in this verse, pride seeks to sit on the throne of God. It conspires to commit treason of the highest order. Like some commentators would call that cosmic treason is what's happening. And they do that, pride seeks to do that through self-exaltation. So verse 4 again, they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city, and a tower whose top will reach into heaven." So the goal is clear. We're going to build a great city, glorious tower, and the top's going to reach into heaven. We find that same vocabulary of cities reaching into heaven in Deuteronomy 1 also. And in that context, it's the fearful Israelites describing the fortified cities of Canaan. So they send spies in, they come back, and they say, their cities are fortified, they're reaching into heaven. So that's what they're describing. They're not literally saying the city's reaching into heaven. They're just talking about how great, how powerful it is, how in control they are. So this is not talking about sneaking into heaven through a trap door at the bottom. This is a language that symbolizes strength, power, autonomy. And this is not a physical insurrection, but it's a moral one, a spiritual one that they're seeking to commit. And if that's not enough, the very fact of their collective disobedience already and disobeying God's command to fill the earth, that shows that their plan is to supplant his authority with their own. It's not to have a closer relationship with God, to build to the heavens, to have communion with him. It's to remove him from the throne, to put themselves in that place instead. So man in his pride, especially when united with other sinners, will always pursue self-deification, making himself in the place of God. So thirdly, another characteristic of pride you see is that pride craves worship and immortality. Verse 4, and let us make for ourselves a name. That's the motivation, to achieve fame and a legacy. One commentator writes, the hatred of being nameless drives men to heroic feats of valor or long hours of drudgery, or what urges them to spectacular acts of shame even, or of unscrupulous self-preferment. In its worst forms, it tempts men to give the honor and glory to themselves, which properly belongs to the name of God and God alone. They wanted to become as famous as the Nephilim before the flood, mighty men who were of old, men of renown. We're going to be the singular culture. We're going to be worshipped as the leaders. This would bring fame and perhaps, they even assumed, spiritual immortality. And John Calvin similarly notes, this is the perpetual infatuation of the world, to neglect heaven and to seek immortality on earth, where everything is fading and transient. So all of this pursuit that they're doing, it's all futility. This delusion of pride that leads to the human creatures to rebel against the sovereign authority of their creator, the God of the universe. Creatures rebelling against creator. And built into the Hebrew concept of the word name and making a name for yourself is identity, purpose. Everything about them is contained in that word from a Hebrew sense of it. So let us make a name for ourselves is essentially, it's a comprehensive rejection of everything that God says about them. I reject who he says I am. I reject any purpose he gives me. I reject any commands he gives me. That's what they're saying by making a name for ourselves. And do you notice anything familiar about the language Moses uses here? Let us make. That sounds pretty familiar if you've read Genesis 1 recently, where God says, let us make man in our image after our likeness. So Moses is framing this using that same language. So you think back to Genesis 1 and realize, wow, this is an outright denial of reality, not just a rejection of authority, but they're denying reality, what happened at the very beginning. So fourthly, last characteristic of pride that you see there is that it seeks security from judgment. Security while at the same time rejecting God and his commandments, rejecting his word. So look at the end of verse 4. So let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. Now, what could possibly be the reason that they're afraid of that happening? Could it be that they remember God's command to fill the earth, which he reiterated after the flood, where he flooded the entire world the last time humanity was united in sinful disobedience? That would make sense. That's probably what they're thinking. But what doesn't make sense is that they're seeking safety apart from trusting and obeying God. They're seeking it in their own pride to preserve their independence from God, independence from the creator and sustainer of all things. That's their goal, to find security apart from their creator and apart from the one who sustains everything. Does that ever go well? As Scott quoted this morning, whoever exalts himself will be what? Humbled. Some commentators on this passage believe that this grand city and tower reveals that not only did humanity dismiss God's commands, but they also didn't trust his promise to never flood the earth again. So that inference is that this elevated compound of a city is an attempt to make a refuge from God's judgment in case he does flood the earth. And that's not explicit here in the text, but it's a feasible explanation to think that they might have been doing that. I mean, if they already reject every command he's given them, Maybe they reject the promises he gave them too. And as foolish as that sounds, there are people today attempting a similar goal of trying to circumvent God's judgment or to maybe manipulate the weather for their own security. Bill Gates, perhaps you've heard of him, is collaborating with other donors backing Harvard University's solar geoengineering research program. And a recent article from May says that they're launching a new study researching the efficacy of blocking sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface. Blocking sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface. That's the insanity of pride, that you would believe that you can just take God's place, manipulate things that are going on in the weather, as if God didn't know how much light we need on the earth, as if things weren't going to play out according to his will and his timeline. That level of arrogance would be completely unbelievable if not for a passage like this. So that's verses 1 through 4. That's man's prideful pursuit of self-exaltation. Now, verses 5 through 9 is the final point. God's gracious response of condescension. Let's look from God's perspective now. So in verse 5, and the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. You see the irony there? Man is seeking to exalt himself with a city and a tower that's so impressive that they think they're making a name for themselves. They'll be worshiped and celebrated. But God, Moses writes, has to come down to see it. So we know that God is spirit and doesn't actually need to get close to know what they're doing. But the idea being expressed here is pretty humbling, right? He also refers to them as the children of men, which can be also translated as sons of men. And the emphasis here is that in comparison to God, these humans are just tiny little creatures, descendants from the first one he created from the dust. Adam, that's what it means, from the earth. And it's not a comment on the worth of or value of human beings. That's just recognizing the gap between us and God. So verses 6 through 8, and the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. So again, you have the emphasis on their unity. But we also see the seriousness of their situation, the gravity of their situation. God says that for this one people with one language, consumed by that pride, nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. And is he saying that they'll actually be able to complete that goal of symbolically reaching heaven and overtaking God's authority or becoming godlike, achieving equality with him? No, of course not. God's not saying that. He's saying now that they've abandoned the mission, the purpose that I've assigned to them, that they are united in their pursuit of self-glory and self-exaltation. There is no wicked act, no sin, no evil that's outside the scope of possibility for them to commit. That's to say that nothing will be impossible for them as it relates to their own ruin, to their own self-destruction. Should they continue down that path of prideful rebellion, there's no limit to the evil they will do. It's good news when God ignores our works and our plans in order to establish and carry his own. So God's about to punish these people. However, it's a gracious punishment because it's ultimately for man's good. Verse 7, come let us go down there and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. So here you have the origin of the diversity of human languages that we have today. The real languages. It's not just like a mumbling or babbling, as you call it. But imagine that at that moment, an entire city just thrust into utter chaos where you can't understand anybody. Families, friends are divided, like the first language barrier in history. Imagine the chaos of that. But how does that demonstrate God's grace toward humanity? You think of the situation, it looks like it's just creating division among people. Like it's just getting rid of all of the unity that they had. How does that show God's grace? Well, first, it restrains that potential for limitless evil that God pointed out about them. That limitless potential for evil of prideful humanity when they're acting in unison. Who knows how much further they could have descended into wickedness. But instead, he compassionately eliminates that capacity for unity. They can't collaborate now. Secondly, it's an act of grace because it realigns humanity with God's good and perfect plan to multiply and to fill the earth. Now, rather than one people with one language striving pridefully for their own autonomy and independence, he's established many dependent cultures. So lastly, God's grace is seen in the preservation of his promise. God maintains his promised plan of redemption and the reconciliation of God and man through the seed of Adam by thwarting humanity's self-destructive pursuit. Verse 9, therefore its name was called Babel because the Lord confused the languages of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. So the very outcome that they thought they could avoid with all of their plans, with all of their working, actually happened to them because of their actions. They were scattered. So God's perfect plan was successfully executed. Those who had exalted themselves were now humbled. So finally, we're going to look at verse 5 just one more time as we close. So remember, based on that chiastic structure, the chiasm that we looked at earlier, the beginning of verse 5 is that central point between all of these parallels in this passage. So that's the central idea Moses is intending to get across. And you see at the beginning of verse 5, the Lord came down. He condescended. He came down. This is what Moses really wants us to see. No matter how high they build the tower, God would still be out of reach. They would have no ability to connect to him. God had to descend to see it, as Moses writes. He had to come down because man can never get to God either physically or spiritually. And as Paul writes in Philippians, right after the passage that Scott was preaching, that because of Christ's obedience, God elevated him and gave him a name above all other names. So you see, the seeds of the gospel are here in God's response. You see the sin that caused them to put this display on with their pride, desire to elevate themselves. But God said, I won't let you do it for your good, for my glory. So as we cling to Jesus Christ, it's there and there alone that we can find the proper way to live, the proper way to go about our business, to pursue goals, to pursue unity. It's only possible through the gospel. So not to elevate ourselves, but to humble ourselves in imitating Christ, giving the glory to God, as opposed to self-glorifying. And it's only through Christ that we can bring that glory to him. Let's pray. God, I thank you for a passage like this that reveals so much about the state of my heart and just the world today, even though it was written thousands of years ago. That the truth and the problem of sinful humanity is still present. And in groups and unity, we just pursue wickedness and to a limitless potential. But you restrain it. You keep it from ultimately becoming self-destructive. You have a plan, and nothing that we do can thwart that. And also the same thing is true in their situation, that nothing could happen until God came down. And that's how we're saved. In your condescension, Lord. You saved us. We can't do anything to get to you physically, spiritually. I thank you for showing that to us, even in this seed and this hint of the gospel. In Jesus' name, amen.